So, friends, as the cantor and I have both mentioned in a couple of different ways this evening, this is a Shabbat of new beginnings. Today is the first Shabbat of a new Hebrew month. This is the month of Nisan, the season of springtime, which itself heralds new growth, new beginnings, and the hope of new life. Nisan, of course, as I mentioned, brings with it also the festival of Passover, which is the celebration of our people's new life, a life of liberation and independence and freedom from slavery. And this Shabbat, we have another new beginning. Also, we begin reading a new book of the Bible, as our Bar Mitzvah students can tell us delightedly. This Shabbat brings us out of the book of Exodus and into the wonderful, beautiful, always inspiring book of Leviticus. I have a very vivid memory about Leviticus from when I was a rabbinical student in the seminary. One of my professors was preparing to lecture about the book of Leviticus, which is, of course, a difficult book to appreciate, an even more difficult book to love. And he said something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, listen, you soon will be Reform rabbis. You will think of yourselves as deeply principled and seriously committed to spiritual and intellectual progress, committed to modernity and ethical rectitude. And you're going to study, as rabbis, this book of Leviticus, which is filled with the worst kinds of ancient stories there are. Stories about blood and gore and animal sacrifice, intricate details about disease and decay, unflinching and unabashed words about the form and function of human bodies, the most intimate details about our relationships with each other. And so this Bible professor said, if you, soon to be modern Reform rabbis, want to have careers of real honesty and real integrity, if you're serious about your commitment to teaching and preaching about the highest and most sophisticated progressive values, when you graduate and go on to serve a synagogue, you should remove the book of Leviticus from your Bibles and make do with 4 books of Moses. I'll come back to that story in a minute, but first another story. I was out of town last week doing some spring break travel with my family. We took our kids to Washington to show them the monuments and memorials and to introduce them to the great institutions of American democracy and American history. Visiting those classical structures and walking through those historic streets is always moving and inspiring, but as it turns out, it became somewhat more complicated for me as an adult than it was when I was a kid. Our ability, of course, to understand the subtleties of history and power increases and broadens as we mature. And it is also true that kids today are taught a somewhat more nuanced and critical portrait of American history than I was when I was their age, which on balance I think is a good thing. But it's also true that my kids and their contemporaries don't see quite as rosy a picture of our nation's history as they might have in a generation or two earlier. And so I could see that for them, having been taught in greater depth and detail about American history, my kids felt a kind of a disconnect, a sort of discomfiting irony when they walked through the marble halls of monuments and statuaries dedicated to the Founding Fathers, whose writings and ideas brought the principles of American liberty and democracy to life, but which also perpetuated the cruelties of colonial slavery and racism. It was a tension that I didn't sense, or at least didn't appreciate, when I was their age. That tension, of course, isn't a new one for anyone who lives in our country and wants to see it clearly for what it is and what it has been over the past 250 years or so. Questions about what America is and what it means, what it stands for, and how we can represent it honestly and respectfully are not novel. These are questions that, in the end, can only be answered equivocally by people with different perspectives and different personal experiences. One of the stops on our tour was through the Capitol building to tour the Great Rotunda and walk through the Statuary Hall. I learned from our tour guide that it was in 1860 that an act of Congress provided for the establishment of a national statuary that would be filled with works of sculptural art provided by every state in the Union. There are today 100 statues, 2 from each state, representing significant historical figures who contributed to the legacy of their home states. Over the years, of course, sensibilities have changed, new biographical information has come to light, and at times the state legislatures have come to feel somewhat less proud of the way that people like William Jennings Bryan or Robert E. Lee reflect their home state's heritage and history. And so the question arose about what's to be done with those states' statues. And that question reminded me about that story that I told you about my Bible professor when I was a student in the seminary. Is it the case that for a state's government to have real integrity and real ethical principles, that it should remove the statues it submitted to the National Statuary? As it turns out, the question has been answered in different ways at different times by different state legislatures and by the architect of the Capitol. Sometimes the statues of unpleasant or controversial historical figures are just moved to less visible and less prominent locations. A notorious racist or enslaver might find his bust moved from the rotunda to a dark niche in a nondescript office hallway. In other cases, a state's government may choose to replace one of its 2 allotted statuary entries. Last year, the Kansas legislature voted to replace the statue of John James Ingalls, a state senator with a somewhat unflattering reputation, with the statue of Amelia Earhart. A few years before that, Ohio withdrew its statue of pro-slavery Governor William Allen and replaced it with one of Thomas Edison. So maybe one of the options is the proper approach for us to embrace as modern, enlightened Jews when we find ourselves confronted with our tradition's troubling and troublesome texts. Maybe instead of reading Leviticus, we ought to consider substituting something else in its place. Maybe we could spend the next 9 or 10 weeks reading poetry, or prophecy, or the biographies of the great ethical minds of our tradition. Or another option could be for us to go ahead and read it, following the traditional prescribed calendar, but just not talk about it all that much. We could have our rabbis and our bar mitzvah students speak in English about more enlightening and ennobling topics while we read Leviticus in Hebrew that few people understand. Or maybe there's room for a third approach, rooted on one hand in a reverence for history and a clear-eyed awareness of ethical evolution and a constantly refining sense of justice in the world on the other. One of my favorite stops on this trip to Washington was our visit to the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian. Washington is a city with more than 70 different museums, but of all of them, this one might be my favorite. I've been there a number of times, and I try to make a point of returning each time I go back. But this time, on my visit to the gallery with my kids, I appreciated something that I hadn't noticed before. One of the centerpiece exhibitions of the museum is the one called America's Presidents. In that section, a visitor is drawn through all of the presidential portraits, displayed in chronological order, starting with Washington and ending with Trump. The most interesting part about the exhibit, aside from the artistry and the remarkable diversity with which the painters and photographers depicted their subjects, was what the curators did to help visitors understand the men in those portraits. In addition to listing the president's dates of birth and death, the years of their terms, the major accomplishments of their administrations, the museum now includes a separate heading on the caption card accompanying each portrait labeled Legacy. And so in addition to the president's major policy positions and his legislative victories and defeats, in addition to the things he did, that little card reflects on how he has been remembered, then and now. The legacy cards catalog their personal failings and their political triumphs alike, putting them into useful and honest context about what they meant to the country they served and the country in which we live today. Each of those 45 men, regardless of affiliation or reputation, is given the same treatment, the same small black type on the same heavy cream-colored card, describing their legacy as we best understand it today from our own particular place in the sweep of American history. The venerated and the celebrated, the disgraced and the impeached, the champions of liberty and masters of the battlefield, the unrepentant enslavers, and the strategists of unforgivable crimes against indigenous peoples. All of them hanging side by side because all of them are equally ours. Their presidential legacies a part of our own American stories. I think that curatorial decision to pair every presidential portrait with a thoughtful statement of legacy was an extremely clever one. Because even when we modern, enlightened thinkers might have the temptation to purge or displace the image of someone whose leadership and ideas are unimaginably far from our own, the museum's stance is instead to offer context and not condemnation. Because the organizers of that exhibit understand correctly that we come to a new appreciation of why history is worth studying when we accept the fact that the people who came before us were not gods. That particular exhibit is emotionally successful because it visually and ideologically demonstrates a continuum from 1 to 45, a sense of dynamic forward movement, tracking the course of our nation's heritage and the way its sense of self has expanded and contracted, shifted and stretched over the years, many times, but by no means always, toward goodness and liberation. And the same is true for the founding fathers of Judaism and for the bedrock words and ideas on which our faith is built. And that's why, finally, about 20 years after he posed the challenge to us, I finally think I've concluded that I disagree with my seminary Bible professor, because I think he was wrong. And I don't think that we would do away with the book of Leviticus today if only we had the guts. Just because we read Leviticus today doesn't mean that we live in the world of Leviticus. Instead, and this is vitally important, we read it today because Leviticus lives in our world and not the other way around. Our history is marked by all kinds of unpleasant and unflattering ideas which have evolved and improved, changing for the better as the light of progress and wisdom have shone upon them. We don't need to look very far at the classical texts of ours or any other ancient religion to find abundant examples of misogyny and racism. We'll quickly and easily see their evidence of our ancestors' unsettling tolerance for slavery and violent punishment. We'll see over and over again the indulgence of xenophobia and homophobia and an abiding suspicion of foreign cultures, foreign peoples, and foreign ideas. But, at least for me, after living with the tension of seeing these ideas in the faith and the tradition that I love, I don't think the right answer is to remove them altogether. No matter how challenging and uncomfortable those ancient ideas may make us, the right remedy is not an ideological purge of ideas or people or perspectives from the past that we consider our intellectual inferiors. Instead, we should do what those Smithsonian curators did with the pictures of James Buchanan and Andrew Jackson and all the others, to offer context, to contextualize their lives and their stories by helping show the full picture of the legacy they leave behind, to acknowledge what they left us, for better and worse, and help us understand how we can build on them to help make a more perfect union. And so, for this reason, much to the dismay of future generations of bar mitzvah kids and their parents, we will continue to live with Leviticus. We'll continue to read those difficult worlds and unsettling stories, continue to engage in the sacred work of the modern mind, to begin with ancient, crude raw materials, and to approach them with the sharp, keen tools of modern thought and modern morality, to make them useful and beneficial and valuable in our world today. Shabbat shalom, everybody.